Hello, my name is Angela Schumann and I am the Shakespeare Whisperer. In this video, I want to ask the question, are the witches in Macbeth seductive? These witches are strange figures, as we know, and perhaps one of the strangest elements of them is that Banquo says, I would think that you are women except for your beards. So already it's kind of like, okay, we're not seeing super attractive witches here. Why do they have beards? I think the point is that they're supernatural, that they're not human, that they're an unholy, unnatural clash of things that shouldn't go together. However, I've never actually seen a production of Macbeth in which the witches are actually shown to have physical beards. Have you? But I want to ask, are they seductive? And to answer that, let's have a look at Act 1, Scene 4, around line 130. So Macbeth is now talking to himself. He's thinking out loud. It's in an aside. And this is what he says. Two truths are told. Oh, and before this, as we know, the witches have prophesied that Macbeth will one day become king. And that's really hit him, as I suppose it would to anybody if supernatural beings appeared to you and told you that you would become a king. So, fair. He says, two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. I thank you, gentlemen. And then he goes back to talking to himself. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? So they told him something that was going to happen. They say, hey, guess what, bud? You're going to be made Thane of Cawdor, and later on you're going to become king. And he's like, okay. And then he goes and they're like, by the way, we're making you Thane of Cawdor. So he's like, holy heck, they told me something true. So if it's bad, why have they told me something true that was successful to me? I am Thane of Cawdor. And yet, if what they've told me is good, why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder is yet but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. So what the heck does that mean? Well, first of all, it becomes apparent that Macbeth has had temptations. So he's not simply saying, really? Thane of Cawdor? Oh my goodness, next I'm going to be king. That's amazing. When's that going to happen? Well, I'll look forward to it. No, he knows that there is a way for him to become king and that he's going to have to kill someone to do it, i.e. the current king. And he's contemplated this before, which is why he's freaking out so much, which is why he's having this kind of physical reaction of guilt. So he says, you know, this horrid image doth unfix my hair, you know, make my hair stand on end. It makes my heart pound at my ribs. It shakes my state of man. It gives me this visceral, violent reaction because I know that I'd have to murder someone, and it freaks me out. So that makes sense. That's kind of normal. And yet if we look more closely at this language, what we see is a suggestion of sexuality. This language has a very sexual layer to it. Oh, Shakespeare talking about sex, didn't see that coming. But yes. So it's kind of hidden in here, but once you notice it, it runs right through this little soliloquy. So the first one is, two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act. Make of that what you will. What kind of act could that be? So already we're getting this suggestion, okay, swelling. And then he says, this supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. Soliciting is, I mean, the footnote in my Norton, the footnote in my Norton edition says urging, this supernatural urging. And on one level, yes, that's what they're doing, they're urging. But soliciting has another meaning as well, and it is what prostitutes do. They solicit you for sex. Or do you solicit a prostitute? Anyway, either way, it's associated with prostitution. So okay, that's sexual element number 2 here. Blah, blah, blah. I am fain of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion? So again, the idea of yielding. Whose horrid image doth unfix my hair. Now, unfix, the footnote in the Norton says to make stand. So it makes my hair stand on end. But another word for making stand is erect. So it's making my hair stand on end. It's making my hair stand erect. Take from that what you will. And make my seated heart knock at my ribs. So it's making my heart thump and pound again. Blah, blah, blah. Is that everything? And it shakes so my single state of man. So he's having this physical reaction that is very, very similar to a sexual reaction. So, oh, and one other element that I want to point out is at the start when he says, two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act. Oh no, it's not there. So he talks about this supernatural soliciting. Here is something called sibilance. And sibilance is essentially when there's a hissing sound. So it's usually through the use of the S sound, but not always. And we hear it in this line, this supernatural soliciting. I think that's interesting because it kind of evokes a snake and evil and danger, but I think there's also a whispering sort of seductive sexual quality to it too. So on one level there's this temptation to evil and there's this horrified, violent physical reaction to this idea of murder. On another level, this reaction is also sexual and suggests sexual temptation. So why would Shakespeare put this sexual language in here with the witch's temptation to murder? I think it's interesting because he seems to be suggesting something about the nature of temptation in general. Macbeth is not convinced to kill Duncan on a rational level through his intellect. Rather, he is seduced on an emotional level and on a physical, visceral level. And I think that that's the case with a lot of sin, and I think that's what Shakespeare was getting at, is that often we don't reason our way into doing something wrong, but rather it works in the same way as seduction. There's a suggestion and we say, oh no, I couldn't, and there's a dance and there's an attraction to it, and before we know it, the worst part of ourselves kind of takes over, the animal part sort of takes over, and in this kind of frenzy we do something that we regret later. And I don't mean something necessarily sexual, but any kind of evil could be interpreted as something that we're sort of seduced into doing. Something to think about. Food for thought.